Jake Morrison watched a fully grown lioness approach him on the African plain, and every survival instinct screamed at him to run until he heard the sound coming from her throat. Not a roar, but a sob. She sat down directly in front of him, looked into his eyes with devastating intelligence, and begged, "Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go." The African sun hung low over the Serengeti plains, painting the acacia trees in shades of amber and gold that seemed to set the entire world ablaze. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow with a weathered bandana, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he surveyed the fence line of the Makina Wildlife Sanctuary. At 38, he had spent the better part of 15 years working as a cowboy on various ranches across 3 continents. But nothing had prepared him for the raw, untamed beauty of East Africa. The land here didn't just challenge you, it transformed you, stripping away everything you thought you knew about yourself and rebuilding you from the ground up. He had come to Kenya 6 months ago, answering an advertisement for an experienced horseman to help manage the cattle operations at a wildlife sanctuary that straddled the line between conservation and sustainable ranching. The position had seemed straightforward enough: maintain the livestock, repair fences, and help transport supplies across the vast property. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was the way the African wilderness would seep into his bones, the way the sound of lions roaring at dawn would become as familiar as his own heartbeat, or the way he would find himself caring more about the wildlife than he ever had about the cattle he was hired to protect. Jake had grown up on a ranch in Montana, the son of a black rodeo champion who had broken barriers and bones in equal measure. His father had taught him everything about horses and cattle, about reading the land and respecting the animals that shared it. But his father had also taught him about prejudice, about the extra effort required to earn respect in a world that often judged you before you opened your mouth. Those lessons had followed Jake across continents, shaping the quiet, competent man he had become, someone who let his work speak louder than his words. The sanctuary was a marvel of conservation efforts, spanning over 40,000 acres of pristine savanna where endangered species roamed freely alongside sustainable cattle herds. The vision belonged to Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a wildlife veterinarian who had inherited the land from her father and transformed it into a model for coexistence between human enterprise and wildlife preservation. She was a force of nature herself, brilliant and passionate, with a fierce determination to prove that conservation and community development could thrive together. Jake had developed a deep respect for her in the months since his arrival, though he kept his growing admiration carefully hidden behind professional courtesy. Today had been routine until about an hour ago. Jake had been checking the northern fence line, repairing a section damaged by a herd of elephants that had pushed through during the night when he first heard the sound. It was unlike anything he had encountered in his months at the sanctuary, a low, mournful cry that seemed to carry across the plains with an almost human quality of desperation. At first, he thought it might be a calf separated from its mother, or perhaps an injured animal calling for help. But as the sound continued, growing closer and more insistent, he realized it was coming from something much larger and far more dangerous. Lions were a constant presence at the sanctuary, their populations carefully monitored and protected. Jake had learned to identify individual prides by their territories and behaviors, had watched from safe distances as they hunted and raised their cubs. He had developed a healthy respect for these apex predators, understanding that they were neither the romanticized noble beasts of legend nor the mindless killers of cautionary tales, but complex, intelligent creatures living according to their own ancient code. The rangers had taught him to read their body language, to recognize the signs of aggression or territorial behavior, and most importantly, to know when to back away slowly and when to stand his ground. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what emerged from the tall grass about 50 yards ahead. The lion was magnificent even in obvious distress, a mature male with a thick mane that caught the afternoon light like spun copper. But it was the animal's behavior that froze Jake in his tracks. The lion wasn't stalking or hunting, wasn't displaying any of the typical predatory behaviors he had been taught to recognize. Instead, the great cat was moving toward him with deliberate steps, stopping every few paces to release that haunting, mournful sound that had first caught his attention. The lion's golden eyes were fixed on Jake with an intensity that seemed almost pleading, and there was something in that gaze that transcended the usual gulf between species. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the rifle slung across his back, a necessary tool for any ranch hand working in lion country. But something stopped him from unslinging it, some instinct that whispered this was not a moment for weapons. The lion stopped about 30 feet away, close enough that Jake could see the individual whiskers on its massive face, could count the scars that marked its muzzle from years of survival in the wild. The animal sat on its haunches like an enormous house cat, and then did something that sent chills down Jake's spine. It raised one massive paw and placed it gently on the ground, then looked back at Jake and released another of those heart-wrenching cries before standing and walking a few steps away. Then it turned back, looking at Jake expectantly, waiting. The message was unmistakable. The lion wanted him to follow. Jake had heard stories, of course. Tales of wild animals seeking human help when they or their young were in distress. Dolphins guiding ships away from danger, elephants leading rangers to injured herd members, even cases of wild animals approaching humans for medical assistance. But those were stories, legends shared around campfires or documented in rare wildlife journals. This was real, happening right now on a dusty plain in East Africa, and Jake Morrison had about 30 seconds to decide whether he was going to trust his instincts or follow the safety protocols that had kept him alive this long. The lion cried again, and in that sound, Jake heard something that reminded him of his own father's voice during those last days in the hospital, a desperate plea for help that transcended words. He thought about Dr. Okonkwo and her belief that animals possessed intelligence and emotional depth that humans too often dismissed. He thought about all the times he had trusted his gut and been rewarded, and all the times he had ignored it and regretted the choice later. Then he made his decision. Jake took a careful step forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving the lion's face. The great cat watched him for a moment, seemed to assess his intention, and then turned and began walking away with purposeful strides. Every few steps, the lion would pause and look back over its shoulder, making sure Jake was following, making sure this strange human understood what was being asked of him. It was the most extraordinary thing Jake had ever witnessed. A wild apex predator actively seeking human assistance, trusting him enough to lead him somewhere important. The terrain grew rougher as they moved away from the fence line, crossing into a section of the sanctuary that Jake rarely visited. The land here was more broken, scattered with rocky outcroppings and dense thickets of acacia that provided perfect cover for wildlife. The lion moved with surprising speed despite its obvious agitation, and Jake found himself almost jogging to keep pace. His mind raced with possibilities about what could have driven this animal to such desperate measures. Was it injured? Had it encountered poachers? Was one of its pride members trapped somewhere? They had been walking for nearly 20 minutes when Jake noticed the change in the lion's behavior. The animal's pace had slowed, and its massive head swung from side to side as if scanning for danger. A low rumble emerged from its chest, not quite a growl, but definitely a warning of some kind. Jake's hand moved to his radio, but he realized with sinking certainty that he was too far from the main compound for a clear signal. He was on his own out here, following a wild lion into increasingly isolated territory, with nothing but his wits and his father's old survival lessons to guide him. The lion stopped at the edge of a dried riverbed, the kind of seasonal watercourse that flooded during the rains, but stood empty and exposed during the dry season. The banks were steep, about 12 feet high, carved by decades of rushing water into smooth clay walls that would be treacherous to climb without proper equipment. The lion looked down into the riverbed, then back at Jake, then down again, and released another of those heart-wrenching cries that seemed to contain all the sorrow in the world. Jake approached the edge carefully, mindful of the crumbling soil, and looked down. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat and his heart clench with a mixture of horror and sudden understanding. At the bottom of the riverbed, partially hidden by shadows and scattered brush, was a lion cub. Even from this distance, Jake could see that the small animal was in serious trouble. It appeared to be caught in something, maybe old wire fencing or a poacher's snare, and its struggles had only made the situation worse. The cub was lying on its side, barely moving, and Jake realized with growing alarm that it had probably been trapped down there for hours, perhaps even overnight. The adult lion beside him released another mournful cry, and Jake finally understood the depth of emotion in that sound. This was a parent's anguish, raw and primal and transcending the boundaries between species. This magnificent predator had somehow recognized that its cub needed help beyond what lion strength or instinct could provide, and it had sought out the one creature on the savanna that might possess the tools and knowledge to save its baby. The trust implicit in that decision was staggering. The courage required to approach a human, to lead a potential threat directly to vulnerable offspring, spoke to a depth of desperation and intelligence that Jake had never truly credited to wild animals before. He pulled his radio and tried again, hoping that perhaps from this higher vantage point he might catch a signal. Static crackled back at him, useless. The main compound was at least an hour's ride away, even if he pushed his horse hard, and that was assuming he could find his way back to where he had left his mount. The cub didn't have an hour. From the way it was lying, barely responsive to its parents' calls, Jake suspected it was severely dehydrated and possibly injured from its struggles against the snare. Every minute counted, and there was no cavalry coming to help him make this decision. The adult lion was watching him with those intelligent golden eyes, and Jake could swear he saw understanding there, a recognition that the human was assessing the situation, trying to determine a course of action. The animal's entire posture radiated tension and hope in equal measure, a parent waiting to see if this gamble on human compassion would pay off or end in tragedy. Jake examined the riverbed more carefully, looking for a safe way down. The walls were steep but not quite vertical, and there were a few places where erosion had created natural steps or handholds. It would be dangerous, especially knowing that an anxious parent lion was watching his every move, ready to interpret any action as either salvation or threat. If he slipped and fell, he could break an ankle or worse, leaving both himself and the cub stranded. If the mother lion decided he was a danger to her cub rather than a helper, she could be on him in seconds, and no amount of cowboy toughness would save him from those claws and teeth. But Jake had not spent 15 years working with animals, had not devoted his life to understanding and respecting creatures great and small, to turn away now when he was so desperately needed. His father had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite the fear. And right now, a baby animal was dying slowly at the bottom of a riverbed while its parent begged for mercy from the only creature that might be able to provide it. Jake looked at the adult lion and said quietly, as if the animal could understand his words rather than just his tone, "I'm going to help. I promise you. I'm going to try everything I can to save your baby. Just please don't attack me while I'm doing it, because then we both lose everything." The lion watched him, its tail twitching with barely contained anxiety, as Jake began the careful descent into the riverbed. The clay wall crumbled beneath Jake's boots as he made his way down, sending small cascades of dirt tumbling ahead of him. He tested each foothold before committing his weight, acutely aware that a fall here could mean a broken leg or worse, and that would leave him trapped at the bottom of this natural pit, with an injured cub and an increasingly agitated parent pacing above. The descent took nearly 5 minutes of careful maneuvering, his hands finding purchase on exposed roots and jutting rocks, his body pressed close to the wall to maintain balance. By the time his boots touched the sandy bottom, his shirt was soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the African heat and everything to do with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The cub was about 15 feet away, partially concealed by a tangle of dead brush that had been carried downstream during the last rainy season and deposited here when the waters receded. As Jake approached slowly, hands visible and movements deliberate, he could hear the young animal's labored breathing, a rattling sound that spoke of exhaustion and dehydration. The cub's eyes were half closed, and it barely reacted to his presence, which was both a blessing and a deeply troubling sign. A healthy cub would have hissed or tried to retreat, would have shown some defensive behavior at the approach of a human. This little one was too far gone to care. Jake knelt in the sand about 6 feet away, taking a moment to assess the situation more carefully. The cub was male, probably about 4 months old, with spots still visible on his tawny coat and oversized paws that promised considerable size once he reached maturity. But right now, he was small and vulnerable and dying, wrapped in coils of old barbed wire that had somehow ended up in this riverbed, probably washed down from an abandoned fence line upstream. The wire had tangled around the cub's left hind leg and across his belly, and his struggles to free himself had only pulled the barbs deeper into his flesh. Dark stains on the sand suggested he had been bleeding, though whether the blood loss was serious, Jake couldn't yet tell. Above them, the adult lion released another cry, and Jake glanced up to see the magnificent animal pacing along the rim of the riverbed, its massive head swinging back and forth as it tracked his movements. The mother, Jake thought, though he couldn't be completely certain. In lion prides, it was often difficult to determine exact relationships, as females cooperatively raised cubs and males came and went. But the intensity of this animal's distress suggested a direct parental bond, the kind of fierce protective love that transcended species boundaries. "Easy now," Jake murmured, not really talking to the cub, but rather narrating his own actions to keep himself calm and focused. "I'm here to help you, little man. Your mama brought me here because she's smart enough to know when something's beyond lion fixing and requires opposable thumbs." He pulled his work gloves from his belt and slipped them on, protection against both the barbed wire and any defensive bites the cub might still have energy to deliver. Then he began the painstaking process of examining how the wire had wrapped around the small body, tracing each strand to understand the pattern of entanglement. The wire was old and rusty, the kind of cheap fencing that had been popular decades ago before better materials became available. It had probably been abandoned in place when the sanctuary expanded, left to rust and eventually break apart under the assault of weather and time. Most of it had been cleared away over the years, but apparently this section had remained, hidden in brush or buried in sediment, waiting like a trap for some unfortunate creature to stumble into it. The barbs had caught in the cub's fur initially, and his instinctive thrashing had pulled the wire tighter, wrapping it around his leg and torso in a constricting embrace that grew more dangerous with every movement. Jake worked with careful precision, starting at the loosest point and gently unwinding the wire strand by strand. His gloves protected his hands from the worst of the barbs, but several times he felt sharp points pierce through to scratch his palms. The cub whimpered softly as Jake worked, not fighting him, but clearly aware of the pain each movement caused. Halfway through the process, Jake had to stop and pull his knife from his belt, using it to cut through several strands that were too tightly wound to simply unwrap. Each cut had to be precise, close enough to free the cub, but careful not to slice into already injured flesh. The sun beat down into the riverbed with merciless intensity, and Jake felt sweat dripping into his eyes as he worked. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, each moment feeling both endless and too short. His entire world had narrowed to this small space, this desperate race against dehydration and shock, this fragile life that depended entirely on his skill and patience. He thought about all the times he had helped birth calves on Montana ranches, about the emergency veterinary procedures he had learned through years of ranch work, about his father's steady hands guiding him through his first difficult delivery. Those memories steadied him now, reminding him that he had done hard things before, that he was capable of this. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 20 minutes, Jake pulled the last strand of wire away from the cub's body. The small animal lay panting in the sand, free but barely conscious, his injuries now fully visible in the harsh sunlight. There were multiple puncture wounds where the barbs had penetrated his skin, several of them still bleeding sluggishly. His left hind leg was swollen and clearly painful, possibly fractured from his struggles against the wire. But most concerning was his overall condition, the sunken appearance of his sides suggesting severe dehydration, the glazed look in his eyes indicating he was sliding toward shock. Jake pulled his canteen from his belt and carefully dribbled water into the cub's mouth, just a little at a time to avoid choking him. The young lion's tongue moved weakly, lapping at the moisture, and Jake felt a surge of hope. The cub was still responsive, still fighting to survive. That meant there was a chance, however slim, that they could pull through this together. He gave the cub a little more water, then wet his bandana and used it to gently clean some of the blood and dirt from the wounds, trying to assess their severity. Above them, the adult lion had stopped pacing and was now lying at the edge of the riverbed, its enormous head hanging over the rim as it watched every movement Jake made. The animal's eyes never left her cub, and Jake could see the tension in every line of that powerful body, the barely restrained instinct to leap down and reclaim her baby, warring against the recognition that the human was helping, not hurting. The next challenge loomed before Jake with daunting clarity. He had freed the cub and provided emergency first aid, but they were still trapped at the bottom of a 12-foot riverbed with a critically injured animal that needed veterinary care immediately. The climb down had been difficult enough when he only had to worry about his own weight and balance. Carrying a lion cub, even a small one, back up that crumbling clay wall would be exponentially more dangerous, and he had to do it with a protective parent watching his every move, ready to interpret any misstep as aggression or threat. Jake looked up at the mother lion, meeting those intelligent golden eyes with as much calm as he could project. "I need to get him out of here," he said quietly, knowing his tone mattered more than his words. "That means I have to carry him, and it's going to look like I'm taking him away from you. But I promise, Mama Lion, I promise I'm bringing him back to you. Just please trust me a little bit longer." The lion's ears flicked forward as if she were truly listening, trying to decode the meaning behind his sounds. Her tail twitched once, twice, and then she settled her massive head on her paws, still watching but no longer radiating quite the same level of barely controlled violence. Jake removed his work shirt, leaving only his undershirt, and carefully fashioned the sturdy cotton fabric into a makeshift sling. He had to move the cub to create the sling properly, and each time he shifted the small body, the cub whimpered in pain, causing the mother above to release low warning rumbles that made the hair on Jake's neck stand up. But she didn't attack, didn't leap down to defend her baby. She watched and waited and trusted, and Jake found himself profoundly moved by the courage that trust required. This animal had every reason to see humans as threats, every instinct screaming at her to protect her cub through violence. Yet somehow she was overriding millions of years of evolutionary programming because she understood that her baby's only chance lay in human hands. Once the sling was secured around his torso with the cub held firmly against his chest, Jake began the ascent. It was immediately clear this would be far harder than the descent. The added weight threw off his balance, and the cub, though weak, still shifted occasionally, his movements unpredictable and destabilizing. Jake's arms burned with effort as he pulled himself up using exposed roots and rock outcroppings, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the crumbling clay. Twice he slipped, sliding back several feet before catching himself, his heart hammering with terror not for himself but for the fragile life pressed against his chest. The mother lion paced again as he climbed, her agitation growing with each difficult moment. She couldn't understand the mechanics of what he was doing, couldn't see that his struggles were necessary parts of the rescue rather than signs of failure or danger. Several times she leaned so far over the edge that Jake thought she might simply leap down, abandoning her vigil to physically reclaim her cub. But each time she pulled back, exercising restraint that must have cost her everything. When Jake finally hauled himself over the rim of the riverbed, collapsing onto solid ground with the cub still secure in his makeshift sling, he had perhaps 5 seconds to catch his breath before 300 pounds of concerned lion mother was standing over him. The animal's face was inches from his own, her breath hot and smelling of meat, her eyes boring into his with an intensity that froze every muscle in his body. This was the moment, he realized, when she would decide if he was savior or kidnapper, friend or foe. Everything hung in that suspended instant, the cub's life, his own life, the fragile bridge of trust they had been building across the vast gulf between their species. Then the mother lion did something that would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. She lowered her massive head and very gently nuzzled her cub, sniffing carefully at his injuries, checking with her superior senses whether her baby was still alive, still viable, still worth the risk she had taken. The cub made a weak mewing sound, responding to his mother's presence even in his diminished state, and the mother lion's entire body seemed to sag with relief. She looked at Jake again, but this time the intensity in her gaze was different, not threatening but somehow acknowledging. She saw him, truly saw him, and in that moment Jake felt a connection he had never experienced before, a recognition that transcended language and culture and species. Slowly, carefully, Jake sat up and began unwrapping the sling from around his body. The mother lion watched but didn't interfere, even when he had to shift the cub's position to free the fabric. When the small body was finally clear, Jake gently laid the cub on the ground between himself and the mother, offering him back to her care. The gesture was important, he sensed, this acknowledgement that the cub belonged to her, that Jake was merely a helper, not a new owner. The mother lion immediately moved closer, positioning her body between Jake and her baby, but there was no aggression in the movement, only the natural protective instinct of a parent. Jake stood slowly, his legs shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, and backed away several steps to give them space. "The cub needs a veterinarian," he said, pulling his radio out again and praying for a signal now that they were back on higher ground. "He's dehydrated, possibly has broken bones, and those puncture wounds need to be cleaned and treated before infection sets in. I have to get help, which means I need to leave you both here for a little while." Static crackled from the radio, then a voice, faint but recognizable. "This is Makina Base, we read you." "Barely, but we read you." Jake's relief was overwhelming. "This is Morrison on the north fence line. I need Dr. Okonkwo and a veterinary emergency kit immediately. I've got an injured lion cub, approximately 4 months old, suffering from wire entanglement injuries, dehydration, and possible fractures. And I've got an adult female lion who's not going to let anyone near her baby unless we handle this exactly right." There was a pause. Then Dr. Okonkwo's voice came through, sharp with professional focus. "Jake, explain the situation. How did you get close enough to treat an injured cub?" "The mother brought me to him," Jake said, and even as he spoke the words, he could hardly believe them himself. "She found me on patrol, led me here, and waited while I freed her baby from barbed wire at the bottom of a riverbed. She's been watching the whole time, and she's trusted me so far, but I don't know how long that trust will hold if the cub's condition deteriorates." There was a longer pause, and Jake could imagine the doctor processing this information, weighing the extraordinary nature of his claim against her knowledge of his character and competence. Finally, she spoke again, her voice carrying new urgency. "We're loading the vehicle now. I'm bringing tranquilizers in case we need them, but if what you're saying is true, if this lioness has genuinely sought human help, then we need to be extremely careful not to betray that trust. It could have implications for conservation work across the entire region. Give me your exact location." Jake rattled off coordinates based on landmarks he recognized, then added, "Doctor, bring extra water and glucose solution. This cub is in bad shape. I've given him what I could from my canteen, but he needs more, and he needs it soon." "Understood. We'll be there in 25 minutes. Jake, I need you to maintain the status quo. Keep the mother calm if you can, keep the cub stable, and for the love of everything, don't get yourself killed before I arrive. I'd hate to lose the best ranch hand we've ever had." The radio crackled back to static, leaving Jake alone with the lions and the weight of what he had just experienced. He settled himself on a flat rock about 10 feet from where the mother lion lay, curled protectively around her cub, close enough to monitor the small animal's condition, but far enough to respect the boundaries that kept all of them safe. The mother watched him constantly, her tail occasionally twitching with residual anxiety, but she seemed to have accepted his presence as non-threatening, at least for now. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the acacia trees in deeper shades of gold and amber. In the distance, Jake could hear the sounds of the sanctuary going about its business, zebras calling to each other, the distant trumpet of elephants, the laugh of hyenas just beginning their evening activities. It was a symphony of life that he had come to love during his months in Africa. A reminder that the world was so much larger and more complex than the narrow slice of it he had known growing up in Montana. His father would have loved this place, would have appreciated the raw honesty of the African wilderness, where life and death walked side by side without pretense or apology. Thinking of his father brought a familiar ache to Jake's chest. Thomas Morrison had died 3 years ago, his body finally giving out after decades of rodeo injuries and hard living. But in those final weeks, as Jake sat beside his hospital bed, his father had shared stories and wisdom that Jake was only now beginning to fully understand. His father had talked about legacy, about the mark a man leaves on the world, not through his possessions or achievements, but through his choices in moments that truly mattered. He had spoken about seeing beyond the obvious, about recognizing that intelligence and emotion weren't exclusively human traits, and that some of the most important lessons came from watching and learning from animals. "Your problem, son," his father had said during one of their last conversations, "is that you think too small about what's possible. You've got gifts with animals, real gifts, but you're wasting them on cattle and horses when the world is full of creatures that need understanding just as much. Don't spend your whole life playing it safe. Go somewhere that challenges everything you think you know." Jake had taken that advice to heart, had applied for the position at Makina specifically because it terrified him, because it would force him to grow in ways that staying on familiar Montana ranches never would. And now, sitting in the African sun with a lion mother and her injured cub, he understood what his father had been trying to tell him. This was legacy, this moment of connection across species boundaries, this act of courage and compassion that might save a life and change the course of conservation work. This was what it meant to live fully, to embrace the challenge of the unknown and find yourself transformed by it. The cub stirred slightly, making a sound of distress, and the mother immediately began licking his face with her rough tongue, grooming him with gentle attention that contrasted sharply with her fearsome appearance. Jake watched the tender scene and felt his throat tighten with emotion. The love between parent and child was universal, he realized, expressed differently across species but fundamentally the same in its intensity and devotion. This lioness would have fought to the death to protect her cub, would have sacrificed herself without hesitation if it meant giving him a chance at survival. But when fighting wasn't enough, when the challenge required skills she didn't possess, she had done something even harder. She had swallowed her fear and her instincts and asked for help from a creature she had every reason to distrust. Jake thought about the courage that must have required, the intelligence needed to recognize both the problem and the potential solution. He thought about all the times humans had underestimated animal cognition, had dismissed behaviors as mere instinct rather than evidence of reasoning and emotional complexity. This lioness had displayed problem-solving ability, had made a calculated risk assessment, and had demonstrated enough theory of mind to understand that humans possessed capabilities she lacked. It was extraordinary, and Jake felt privileged beyond measure to have been chosen as the recipient of her desperate trust. The sound of engines broke the silence, growing louder as vehicles approached across the rough terrain. The mother lion's head snapped up, her ears swiveling toward the noise, and Jake could see tension returning to her powerful body. She rose to her feet, positioning herself directly over her cub, and released a warning growl that resonated in Jake's chest. "Easy," Jake said softly, standing slowly with his hands visible. "These are friends coming to help. I know the noise is scary. I know more humans means more danger in your experience, but you trusted me this far. Trust me just a little bit longer." Two Land Rovers appeared over the rise, moving slowly to avoid spooking the lions. Jake recognized Dr. Okonkwo in the lead vehicle, her dark face visible through the windshield, her expression intense with focus. The vehicles stopped about 50 yards away, far enough to minimize threat but close enough for the medical team to deploy quickly if needed. The doors opened and Dr. Okonkwo emerged, followed by two of the sanctuary's rangers and a veterinary technician carrying a large medical kit. The doctor was in her mid-40s, tall and striking, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a presence that commanded respect from both humans and animals. She had dedicated her life to wildlife conservation, had fought against poachers and bureaucrats and her own family's expectations to build something meaningful here on her ancestral land. Jake had developed profound respect for her in the months since his arrival, had watched her perform medical miracles on injured animals and navigate complex political situations with equal skill. If anyone could help them through this delicate situation, it was Dr. Amara Okonkwo. She surveyed the scene with professional precision, taking in the injured cub, the protective mother, and Jake standing between them like some kind of interspecies mediator. Then she turned to her team and began issuing quiet instructions, her voice too low for Jake to hear, but her gestures clear. The veterinary tech began unpacking supplies while the rangers took up positions that would allow them to intervene if the situation deteriorated, but without presenting an obvious threat to the lions. Dr. Okonkwo approached slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening, carrying a medical bag in one hand while the other remained visible and empty. She stopped about 15 feet from Jake, far enough that the mother lion wouldn't perceive her as an immediate threat, and took a long moment to simply observe. Jake could see her analytical mind working, processing the dynamics of the situation, calculating risks and opportunities. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the still afternoon air. "Jake, I need you to understand something before we proceed. What's happening here is unprecedented in my 20 years of wildlife management. Wild lions don't seek human help. They avoid us. They tolerate us if they must, but they don't trust us with their most vulnerable. If we handle this wrong, if we break the trust this mother has placed in you, in us, we don't just lose an opportunity. We potentially teach her and every lion who learns from her that humans are not to be trusted under any circumstances. The implications could ripple through the entire ecosystem." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. The mother lion was watching Dr. Okonkwo with intense focus, her body coiled and ready to spring if this new human made any threatening moves. But she hadn't attacked, hadn't even growled beyond that initial warning. She was waiting, assessing, giving them a chance to prove their intentions were benign. "What do you need me to do?" Jake asked quietly. "I need you to maintain your position as the bridge between species. She's bonded with you, accepted you as safe. If I try to approach the cub directly, she'll likely attack. But if you're involved in the treatment, if you're the one handling her baby while I guide you, we might be able to work within the boundaries of trust she's established." Dr. Okonkwo set her medical bag down and began removing supplies, laying them out where both Jake and the lioness could see them. Transparency was crucial, she knew. Animals understood predatory behavior, understood concealment and sudden movements as precursors to danger. By making every action visible and predictable, they could minimize the mother's anxiety. "Can you approach the cub without triggering an attack?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. Jake considered the question carefully. The mother had allowed him to handle her cub before, had watched him climb out of the riverbed with the small body pressed against his chest. But that had been in extremis when the cub was trapped and the mother had no other options. Now they were on level ground, and the mother had her baby back within her immediate protection. Would she allow Jake's renewed contact, or had the temporary trust expired now that the immediate crisis was resolved? "Only one way to find out," Jake said. He began moving toward the lions with the same slow, deliberate pace he had used before, his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. The mother lion's eyes tracked his every step, her tail lashing once in warning. But she didn't rise, didn't bare her teeth, didn't do any of the things that would signal an imminent attack. When Jake was within arm's reach of the cub, he stopped and very slowly knelt in the grass. The mother's face was now less than 3 feet from his own, close enough that he could count the individual whiskers on her muzzle, could see the gold and amber patterns in her eyes. "I'm here to help," Jake said softly, maintaining eye contact in what he hoped was a calming rather than challenging way. "Your baby is hurting, and we can make the pain stop. We can clean his wounds and give him medicine and make sure he gets strong again. But we need you to let us work." The lion's ears flicked forward, and Jake could swear she was listening, trying to understand the meaning behind his sounds. He extended his hand slowly, palm down, letting her sniff his scent. Her whiskers tickled his skin as she investigated, her breath warm against his hand. Then she did something that made Jake's heart skip. She pushed her massive head against his hand, just for a moment, a gesture that in domestic cats would signal affection and trust. It was acknowledgement, Jake realized. She was telling him she understood, that she was giving him permission. Jake looked back at Dr. Okonkwo and nodded. She approached immediately, dropping to her knees beside him and opening her medical kit with practiced efficiency. Her movements were smooth and confident, the result of thousands of hours working with wild animals in stressful situations. She had learned long ago that confidence was contagious, that animals could sense hesitation or fear and would respond to it with their own anxiety. "All right," she said quietly, more to herself than to Jake or the lions. "Let's see what we're dealing with." She began her examination with the gentlest possible touch, her fingers probing carefully around the cub's injuries while Jake held the small animal steady. The mother lion watched with laser focus, occasionally rumbling deep in her chest when the cub whimpered, but she didn't interfere. Dr. Okonkwo worked quickly but thoroughly, cleaning the puncture wounds with antiseptic solution, checking the swollen leg for fractures, assessing the overall condition of the small patient. "Multiple penetrating wounds from the barbed wire," she narrated softly. "Significant soft tissue damage, but no major blood vessels compromised. The left hind leg has a hairline fracture of the femur. Painful, but it should heal with rest. Primary concern is dehydration, and the risk of infection from these contaminated wounds. She pulled a pre-filled syringe from her kit. I'm going to administer broad-spectrum antibiotics and a mild painkiller. The dosage is calculated for his estimated weight. Then we need to get fluids into him, either orally if he'll drink or subcutaneously if not. Jake held the cub gently as Dr. Okonkwo administered the injection, and he felt the small body tense against the needle's prick. The mother lion rose to her feet at her cub's distressed cry, her lips pulling back to reveal teeth that could crush bone. Every human froze, barely breathing, as the massive predator took one step forward, then another, bringing her within striking distance. "Easy, Mama," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "We're almost done. Just a little more medicine, and then he'll feel so much better." The lion stared at him, and in that moment Jake understood that they had reached the absolute limit of her tolerance. She had allowed strangers to touch her baby, had watched them cause him additional pain with their mysterious tools and procedures, had overridden every protective instinct because some deep intelligence told her it was necessary. But she was done now. Her patience was exhausted, her trust stretched to the breaking point. Whatever else needed to happen would have to happen on her terms or not at all. Dr. Okonkwo understood the situation as clearly as Jake did. She capped the syringe and set it aside, then slowly pulled out a bowl and a liter of water enriched with electrolytes. "I'm going to leave this here," she said quietly, setting the bowl near the cub but not touching him again. "He needs to drink as much as possible over the next few hours. If he won't drink on his own, the subcutaneous fluids can wait until tomorrow when we check on him again." She began gathering her supplies, moving with deliberate slowness, making it clear through every action that she was retreating, not attacking. "Jake, we need to give them space now." Jake stood slowly, maintaining eye contact with the mother lion until the last possible moment before turning away. It felt wrong somehow, like abandoning the cub after everything they had been through together, but he understood the necessity. They had pushed the boundaries of trust as far as they dared for one day. Any further intrusion would transform help into harassment, would teach the mother lion that humans couldn't be trusted to respect boundaries. He walked backward for the first several steps, then turned and followed Dr. Okonkwo to where the vehicles waited. The team retreated to a distance of about 100 yards, far enough that the lions wouldn't feel constantly threatened, but close enough to observe through binoculars. Dr. Okonkwo set up a spotting scope on a tripod, adjusting the focus to bring the mother and cub into sharp relief. The veterinary technician, a young Kenyan woman named Njeri, who had been with the sanctuary for 3 years, pulled out a detailed observation log and began recording notes about the cub's condition, the mother's behavior, and the treatment administered. The 2 rangers, veterans of countless wildlife encounters, positioned themselves to maintain watch in all directions, aware that in the bush, focusing too intently on one situation could leave you vulnerable to dangers approaching from elsewhere. Jake found himself unable to look away from the scene through the binoculars Dr. Okonkwo handed him. The mother lion had immediately moved to her cub once the humans retreated, nuzzling him carefully, and then settling her body around him in a protective curve. Her tongue worked methodically over his fur, cleaning away the blood and dirt that still clung to him, grooming him with the dedicated attention of a mother who had nearly lost her child. After several minutes of this tender care, she nudged the water bowl closer with her nose and then gently pushed the cub's head toward it. The small animal's tongue emerged, lapping weakly at the electrolyte solution. And Jake felt a surge of relief so powerful it made his knees weak. "He's drinking," Jake said, and was surprised to hear his voice crack with emotion. Dr. Okonkwo glanced at him, her expression softening with understanding. "You did an extraordinary thing today, Jake. I've been working with wildlife for 2 decades, and I've never seen anything quite like what I witnessed here. That lioness chose you specifically, trusted you with her most precious possession. Do you understand how rare that is, how remarkable? Jake lowered the binoculars and met her eyes. "I was just in the right place at the right time." She shook her head firmly. "No, it was more than that. Animals can sense things about people, qualities that go beyond what we show on the surface. She sought you out because something in you called to something in her. Maybe it was the way you move around animals, that calm confidence you have. Maybe it was simply fate putting the right person in the right place at the right moment. But it matters, Jake. This matters in ways we won't fully understand for years to come." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. In the golden light, the mother lion looked mythical, ancient, a living connection to the Africa that had existed long before humans arrived with their fences and their roads and their complicated relationship with the natural world. Jake thought about the journey that had brought him here, the grief that had pushed him to leave Montana, the restlessness that had sent him searching for something he couldn't quite name. His father had told him to find challenges that would change him, and he had certainly found that in Africa. But he had found something else too, something unexpected and precious. He had found purpose, not in the cattle management or fence repair that formed his official duties, but in moments like this, moments of genuine connection across the vast divide between human and wild. Dr. Okonkwo was setting up a night vision camera on another tripod, equipment that would allow them to monitor the lions throughout the night without disturbing them with lights or noise. "Jerry, you and Kamau will take the first watch, 4-hour shifts, and call me immediately if there's any significant change in the cub's condition or if the mother shows signs of relocating him. We need to track where they go if they move, because we'll need to do follow-up treatment within 48 hours. The Rangers nodded their understanding and began preparing for their vigil, pulling out thermoses of coffee and settling into positions that would allow them long hours of patient observation. Jake found himself reluctant to leave, as if his presence was somehow still necessary to ensure the cub's survival. But Dr. Okonkwo gently took his arm and steered him toward the Land Rover. "Come on, Cowboy. You've had enough adventure for one day. You need food, water, and probably about 12 hours of sleep. We'll come back at first light to check on them." Jake allowed himself to be led away, though he looked back multiple times, watching the mother and cub until distance and failing light made them impossible to see. The drive back to the main compound was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. The sanctuary headquarters was a cluster of buildings constructed from local stone and timber, designed to blend with the landscape rather than dominate it. There was the main house where Dr. Okonkwo lived, several smaller cottages for staff, a clinic for treating injured animals, offices, storage buildings, and the stables where the sanctuary's horses were kept. Jake's cottage was modest but comfortable. A single room with a bed, a desk, and a small bathroom. Everything he needed and nothing he didn't. But Dr. Okonkwo didn't take him to his cottage. Instead, she pulled up in front of the main house and gestured for him to follow her inside. "You need a proper meal and proper company," she said, brooking no argument. "Maria has made enough vegetable stew to feed an army, and I'm not letting you sit alone in that cottage, replaying the day's events until you drive yourself crazy with worry." Jake started to protest, then realized he was grateful for the company, for the chance to process everything that had happened with someone who understood the magnitude of it. The main house was spacious and welcoming, decorated with a mixture of traditional African art and modern furniture that reflected Dr. Okonkwo's dual heritage, deeply rooted in her Igbo culture, but shaped by education in Europe and America. The smell of cooking filled the air, rich with spices and the earthy aroma of root vegetables. Maria, the house manager who kept the sanctuary running smoothly behind the scenes, emerged from the kitchen with a smile that lit up her weathered face. "Mr. Jake, I heard about your adventure with the lions. You must be starving. Sit, and I'll bring you food fit for a hero." Jake felt his face warm with embarrassment. "I'm no hero, Maria. I just helped an animal that needed help." Dr. Okonkwo settled into a chair across from him, accepting a glass of wine that Maria poured from a bottle on the sideboard. "That's exactly what makes you a hero, Jake. You saw a need and you responded without hesitation, despite the danger, despite the uncertainty. Most people would have walked away, would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem or wasn't worth the risk. You didn't." Maria brought out bowls of rich vegetable stew, thick with sweet potatoes, carrots and beans, seasoned with ginger and garlic and herbs from the garden she tended behind the main house. There was fresh bread still warm from the oven and cold water flavored with sliced lemons. Jake realized he was ravenous, that he hadn't eaten since breakfast that morning, before the world had shifted and he had found himself chosen by a desperate mother lion to save her dying cub. He ate gratefully, letting the food ground him in the present moment, letting the familiar ritual of a shared meal ease some of the tension that still hummed through his body. Dr. Okonkwo watched him with thoughtful eyes, occasionally asking questions about specific details of his encounter. She wanted to understand the sequence of events, the lioness's behavior patterns, the precise nature of the cub's injuries. But Jake sensed she was also assessing something else, perhaps trying to understand the qualities in him that had made him the recipient of such extraordinary trust. He answered her questions honestly, trying to remember every detail, every moment of that strange communion between himself and the wild mother who had sought his help. When the meal was finished and Maria had cleared away the dishes, Dr. Okonkwo refilled her wine glass and poured a small whiskey for Jake, remembering from previous conversations that he preferred it to wine. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the night sounds of the African bush through the open windows, the chorus of insects, the distant call of a nightjar, the occasional roar of lions from somewhere far across the sanctuary, all of it forming the soundtrack of this wild place they both loved. "I want to tell you something," Dr. Okonkwo said finally, her voice taking on a more personal tone than Jake had heard from her before, "about why this sanctuary exists, about what it means to me." Jake waited, sensing that she was about to share something important, something that would help him understand not just the place but the woman who had created it. She stared into her wine glass as if seeing the past reflected in its dark surface. "My father bought this land 40 years ago when Kenya was still finding its footing as an independent nation. He was a businessman, successful, pragmatic, interested in profit and status, but he had this wild dream about creating a space where wildlife and human enterprise could coexist, where conservation didn't mean locking away land but finding sustainable ways to live alongside nature." She paused, lost in memory. Everyone told him he was crazy. His business partners, his friends, even my mother thought he was throwing away good money on an impossible dream. But he persisted, bought the land, started experimenting with different models of sustainable ranching alongside wildlife corridors. He died before he could fully realize his vision, killed by poachers who mistook him for a rival gang member when he confronted them about elephant ivory. I was 23 years old, fresh out of veterinary school, and suddenly I was inheriting 40,000 acres and a half-finished dream. Jake could hear the grief still present in her voice, the wound that even decades couldn't fully heal. "So you finished what he started." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I tried to. I spent years fighting with government officials who wanted to appropriate the land for development, with neighboring ranchers who saw wildlife as competition for grazing, with my own family who thought I should sell everything and live a normal life. There were times I wanted to give up, times when the challenges seemed insurmountable and the vision seemed impossible." "What changed?" Jake asked quietly. She looked at him directly, her dark eyes intense with conviction. "Moments like what happened today. Moments that remind me why this work matters, why the struggle is worth it. Every time we save an injured animal, every time we prove that wildlife can coexist with human development, Every time we witness something extraordinary, like a lioness trusting a human enough to lead him to her injured cub, we take one more step toward realizing my father's dream. And maybe, just maybe, we inspire others to believe it's possible too. Jake felt something shift in his understanding of Dr. Okonkwo in the sanctuary. This wasn't just a job for her, wasn't just a conservation project or a business venture. It was a legacy, a living memorial to her father, a daily act of faith that the world could be better than it was. He thought about his own father, about the legacy of courage and compassion Thomas Morrison had left him, about how both he and Dr. Okonkwo were carrying forward dreams that had been planted by people they loved and lost. "Your father would be proud of what you've built here," Jake said. "Doctor." Okonkwo's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her smile was genuine now, warm and grateful. "Thank you, Jake. That means more than you know." She took a sip of her wine, then set the glass down with decision. "Which is why I want to propose something. I want to document what happened today, not just in clinical observation logs, but in a comprehensive case study. With your permission, I'd like to write a paper about this encounter, submit it to wildlife journals, use it as evidence for the kind of intelligence and emotional complexity that conservation efforts need to acknowledge and protect." Jake felt uncomfortable with the attention, but understood the importance of what she was suggesting. If it helps protect lions, helps people understand them better, then of course you have my permission. But I'm not interested in publicity for myself. Make it about the lioness, about her courage and intelligence. Make it about what we can learn from her. Dr. Okonkwo nodded, clearly pleased with his response. "That's exactly the approach I intend to take. But Jake, you need to understand that this story is going to attract attention whether you want it or not. A wild lioness seeking human help to save her cub, a cowboy from Montana becoming a bridge between species. It's the kind of story that captures imaginations. We'll need to manage how it's told, make sure the focus stays on conservation and animal welfare rather than sensationalism." The thought of publicity made Jake uncomfortable, but he trusted Dr. Okonkwo to handle it appropriately. "As long as it serves the mission of the sanctuary, I'll cooperate however you need me to." They talked for another hour, planning the next day's return to check on the cub, discussing protocols for follow-up treatment, considering scenarios they might face. Would the mother allow them near again, or had her tolerance expired with the immediate crisis? Would the cub's condition improve overnight, or would infection and shock still pose life-threatening risks? There were so many unknowns, so many variables they couldn't control. All they could do was prepare as thoroughly as possible and hope that the trust established today would extend into tomorrow. When Jake finally returned to his cottage, he was exhausted, but too keyed up to sleep. He sat on his small porch, looking out at the star field that stretched impossibly vast above the African plains. The sky here was different from Montana, the constellations unfamiliar, but the sense of infinite possibility was the same. He thought about the lioness and her cub, wondered if they were sleeping peacefully now or if the mother was keeping anxious vigil through the night. He thought about the trust she had placed in him, the vulnerability she had shown, the courage it must have taken to approach a human despite every instinct warning her away. Dawn came to the Serengeti with breathtaking swiftness, the sun climbing over the horizon and flooding the plains with golden light that seemed to set the grass ablaze. Jake had managed only a few hours of fitful sleep, his dreams filled with images of lions and barbed wire and desperate golden eyes begging for help. He was up before his alarm, dressed and ready, when Dr. Okonkwo's Land Rover pulled up outside his cottage just after sunrise. The doctor looked as though she had slept as poorly as Jake, her face drawn with worry despite her professional composure. "Jerry radioed in about an hour ago," Dr. Okonkwo said as Jake climbed into the vehicle. "The mother and cub are still at the same location. The cub drank water throughout the night, and there's been no sign of the rest of the pride, which is both good and concerning. Good because it means fewer variables to manage, concerning because it might indicate the mother has been temporarily ostracized for her unusual behavior. Jake felt his stomach clench with anxiety. Would the other lions reject her for seeking human help, for breaking some unspoken code about maintaining distance from the two-legged creatures who were both threat and salvation to Africa's wildlife? The drive to the observation site seemed to take forever, though in reality it was less than 30 minutes. As they approached, Jake could see the ranger's vehicle still positioned at a respectful distance, and through binoculars he spotted the familiar forms of the mother lion and her cub. His heart leaped with relief at seeing them both still alive, still together. The cub was lying in a different position than last night, which meant he had moved, which meant he had energy and strength enough to shift his body. It was a small sign, but Jake seized on it with desperate hope. They parked beside the ranger's vehicle, and Dr. Okonkwo immediately began reviewing the observation logs from the night watch. Jerry had documented every detail: the times the cub drank water, the frequency of the mother's grooming behaviors, the brief periods when both animals seemed to sleep, the single instance when the mother had risen and paced the perimeter as if checking for threats. It painted a picture of a parent keeping anxious vigil, unable to fully rest, while her baby remained vulnerable, torn between the instinct to move him to safer ground and the recognition that he was too weak for relocation. "All right," Dr. Okonkwo said, lowering the log and looking at Jake seriously. "We need to do a follow-up examination and administer more fluids and antibiotics. The question is whether she'll allow us near again. Yesterday was crisis mode, pure survival instinct overriding everything else. Today her cub is alive and has had water and medicine. She might feel the danger has passed and decide we're no longer needed or welcome." Jake understood the concern. In the lioness's mind, the humans had served their purpose. She might now see them only as potential threats to be driven away. But there was also the possibility that the trust established yesterday had created a new understanding, a bridge that could be crossed again if approached with the same respect and care. "Let me try first," Jake said. "Alone. If she accepts me, then you can join us. But let's not overwhelm her right away." Dr. Okonkwo hesitated, clearly torn between professional caution and trust in Jake's instincts, then nodded. "Take this," she said, handing him a medical kit. "Basic supplies for cleaning wounds and administering injections. If you can get close enough, prioritize the antibiotic shot and fluid replacement. Everything else can wait if necessary." Jake took the kit and began walking slowly toward the lions, his heart pounding but his steps steady and sure. He was acutely aware of being watched not just by the lioness but by the entire team behind him, all of them holding their breath to see if yesterday's miracle could be repeated. The mother lion's head came up as he approached, her eyes locking onto him with intense focus. Jake stopped about 20 feet away, the same distance he had maintained yesterday before being given permission to come closer. The lioness rose to her feet, positioning herself between Jake and her cub, and for a terrible moment he thought she was preparing to charge. But then she did something unexpected. She sat down, her tail curled around her body, and simply watched him. It was neither welcome nor warning, but rather a state of assessment. She was giving him the chance to prove his intentions, to demonstrate that he was still the helper from yesterday and not a new threat. Jake set the medical kit on the ground and sat down himself, mirroring her posture in a gesture of non-aggression. He made no move toward the cub, didn't try to close the distance, just sat quietly in the morning sun and let the lioness observe him. Minutes passed, marked only by the call of birds and the whisper of wind through the grass. It was a test of patience, a trial of trust, and Jake understood instinctively that rushing would destroy everything they had built yesterday. So he waited, breathing slowly, his body relaxed, projecting calm and peaceful intention with every line of his posture. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, the lioness stood and walked toward him. Jake's every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to put distance between himself and this apex predator who could kill him in seconds if she chose. But he remained motionless, trusting in the connection they had forged, believing in her intelligence and her memory of yesterday's help. She stopped directly in front of him, so close that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, could smell the distinctive scent of wild lion, earth and musk and raw animal vitality. Then she lowered her massive head and pressed it against his shoulder, a gesture so trusting and affectionate that Jake felt tears spring to his eyes. "Thank you for remembering me," he whispered, slowly raising one hand to rest gently on her neck. "Thank you for trusting me again." The lioness rumbled deep in her chest, not quite a purr but something similar, a sound of acknowledgement and acceptance. Then she turned and walked back to her cub, looked at Jake over her shoulder, and lay down beside the small body. The invitation was clear. She was giving him permission to approach, to continue the work of healing her baby. Jake picked up the medical kit and moved slowly to kneel beside the cub. The small animal looked better than yesterday. His eyes were brighter, more alert, and when Jake gently touched his uninjured leg, the cub tried to pull away, a sign of returning strength and spirit. The wounds from the barbed wire looked cleaner, the mother's constant grooming having removed much of the dried blood and dirt. The swelling in the injured leg seemed slightly reduced, suggesting the anti-inflammatory properties of the medication were taking effect. Jake worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning each puncture wound with antiseptic solution, while the mother lion watched with unwavering attention. The cub protested weakly, making small, mewling sounds that immediately brought his mother's face close to his, her rough tongue licking his ears in comfort. It was a scene of such tender domesticity that Jake almost forgot these were wild predators, dangerous and unpredictable by nature. But that was the miracle of this moment, the recognition that wildness and gentleness were not opposites but two sides of the same coin, that a creature capable of bringing down a zebra could also show infinite patience and love toward her vulnerable offspring. When Jake prepared the antibiotic injection, he paused and looked at the mother lion. "This is going to hurt him for just a second, but it will help him heal. I need you to understand that and stay calm." The lioness's eyes met his, and Jake could swear he saw understanding there, a recognition that temporary pain served a greater purpose. He administered the injection quickly and efficiently, and though the cub cried out and the mother tensed, she didn't interfere. Instead, she immediately began grooming her baby, soothing him with the attention only a mother could provide. Jake was preparing the subcutaneous fluids when he heard footsteps behind him. Dr. Okonkwo was approaching slowly, her movements cautious but purposeful. The mother lion's head swung toward this new presence, and Jake held his breath, wondering if the tolerance she had shown him would extend to others. But after a long moment of assessment, the lioness seemed to accept the doctor's presence, perhaps recognizing the scent from yesterday or simply understanding that anyone Jake trusted could be trusted in turn. Dr. Okonkwo knelt beside Jake, and together they administered the fluids, working in quiet harmony while the mother watched over them like a supervisor, ensuring her baby received proper care. The cub's response to the treatment was immediate and encouraging. Within minutes of receiving the fluids, his eyes brightened further, and he tried to lift his head, a gesture of vitality that brought smiles to both human faces. The mother lion responded to her baby's improved condition with visible relief, her entire body relaxing as some invisible tension finally released. She began grooming him with renewed energy, her tongue working over every inch of his small body as if she could heal him through the sheer force of maternal devotion. Dr. Okonkwo pulled out a camera and began taking photographs, documenting the scene with professional detachment even as Jake could see tears glistening in her eyes. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. In 48 hours, we've witnessed a complete reversal of everything we thought we knew about wild lion behavior. She's not just tolerating our presence, she's actively cooperating with the treatment. Look at how she positions herself to give us better access to his wounds. That's not instinct, Jake. That's intelligence and trust operating at a level most people would never believe possible. Jake watched the mother lion and felt his own throat tighten with emotion. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the grief that had driven him from Montana, the restlessness that had carried him across oceans to this wild place where life and death danced together under an endless sky. He thought about his father's final words, about finding challenges that would change him, about recognizing that the greatest lessons came from watching and learning from animals. His father would have loved this, would have understood the profound privilege of being chosen by a wild creature for such an intimate act of trust. As the morning sun climbed higher, the cub became more animated, trying to stand on wobbly legs that couldn't quite support his weight yet. The mother lion gently pushed him back down with her nose, a clear message that rest was required before adventure. But the attempt itself was encouraging, evidence that the worst was behind them and that with continued care, this small lion would grow into the magnificent predator he was meant to become. Dr. Okonkwo made notes in her observation log, documenting every detail for the case study that would eventually reach wildlife journals and conservation conferences around the world, carrying the message that animals were far more complex and intelligent than most humans gave them credit for. After completing the treatment, Jake and Dr. Okonkwo retreated to give the lion space, but this time the mother didn't seem anxious about their departure. She seemed to understand that they would return, that the humans were now part of her cub's healing journey rather than a threat to be endured. As they walked back to the vehicles, Dr. Okonkwo turned to Jake with an expression of wonder and gratitude. "You've given us all a gift, Jake. This story, this experience, it's going to change how people think about wildlife, about the possibility of coexistence and mutual respect between humans and animals. Your father would be proud." Jake felt emotion overwhelm him then, tears finally spilling over as the accumulated stress and fear and wonder of the past 2 days found release. He thought about his father dying in that Montana hospital, about the legacy of courage and compassion Thomas Morrison had left behind, about how that legacy had led Jake to this moment on an African plain where a wild lioness had trusted him with her most precious possession. He thought about Dr. Okonkwo's father, killed by poachers while trying to protect the wildlife he loved, and how his daughter had transformed grief into purpose, turning loss into a sanctuary where miracles like this could happen. In the weeks that followed, Jake and the veterinary team made daily visits to monitor the cub's recovery. The mother lion's trust never wavered, and gradually the cub grew stronger, his injuries healing until the day came when he could run and play like any healthy young lion. The pride eventually accepted both mother and cub back, though the mother lion maintained a unique relationship with Jake, approaching him whenever he worked in her territory, showing none of the wariness typical of wild lions. It was as if she had declared him honorary pride member, safe from the dangers that other humans represented. The story spread as Dr. Okonkwo had predicted, but she managed it carefully, ensuring the focus remained on conservation and the intelligence of wildlife, rather than sensationalism. The case study became a landmark in animal behavior research, cited in papers about animal cognition and emotional complexity. But for Jake, the true impact was more personal. That crying lion who had begged him to follow, who had trusted him when trust should have been impossible, had given him something precious beyond measure. She had shown him that courage came in many forms, that intelligence transcended species boundaries, and that love, whether between parent and child or between beings from different worlds, was the most powerful force in nature. In saving her cub, Jake had found redemption for his own grief, purpose for his wandering soul, and proof that his father's lessons about respect and compassion for all creatures had been more than just words. They were a roadmap to moments like this, moments that changed everything, and reminded him why life, in all its wild and unpredictable beauty, was always worth fighting for.